book, Love Walked Among Us, Paul Miller begins with a story. Begins one of his chapters with a story. Excuse me. It's a story that is a very simple and very ordinary story. But I think you'll find that it's a story that many of us might find we can relate to. Walter, a friend of mine, came home excited because a fellow worker had apologized to him for something he had done several years ago. Walter told his wife, and she responded with a curt, "Oh, whatever." He was initially taken aback, stunned by his wife's response, but after a few minutes he asked her where she had purchased some new furniture, and they talked about how it fit best in the room. When Walter mentioned this to me, I wondered why he hadn't retaliated with silence when she dismissed him, in effect telling her, "You're not interested in me, why should I be interested in you?" Why did he take interest in her? He told me that he had known his wife was still smarting from some honest words he had said a couple of days before. Why add another wound when the first one hadn't healed? He also knew she was having a hard time with someone else, and it might have spilled over into her conversation with him. And he knew she wasn't feeling well, and there simply wasn't the time to be honest. This simply wasn't the time to be honest in a way that would have been helpful. Walter's honesty was shaped by his compassion for his wife. Walter reminded me Jesus' honest confrontation was always for people. The silence of Walter was his love and compassion for his wife, as when retaliation would certainly have been justified after the way she had responded to him. And so, Miller titles his chapter, "A Time to Shut Up." I resisted the temptation to call my sermon "A Time to Shut Up," given the number of times as parents who tell their children, "That's not a nice thing to say." But I am going to be looking this morning because Paul Miller's story sent me in search of the places where silence is significant in Scripture and has something to teach us about the compassion and love which we see in the life of Jesus. And we're going to see that in Jesus' actions. We're also going to see it in Jesus' experience. And we're also going to take a trip into the Old Testament to see some things where silence was so important. Many of you may have heard the story of Dallas Willard. Dallas Willard was a professor of philosophy, a renowned and highly respected professor of philosophy at USC. There was a day when a belligerent student decided he disagreed with what Willard was teaching, and he decided to respond in an arrogant and rude way. And so this student held forth, and when he'd finished, rather than responding, Dallas decided to stop the class early and sent everybody home. Needless to say, some of his students came up to him and said, "Why on earth did you do that? You could have destroyed him." with just a few words. To which Dallas responded, I am practicing the discipline of not having the last word. A challenging discipline, to say the least. But in the context of the lecture and the student, it was the kind and compassionate response to that young man at that time. We're going to turn first to Mark chapter 14. And we're going to, that is the time when Jesus has the Last Supper is winding down, and Jesus has been teaching and talking to his disciples, and he finally says in verse 27, he says, all of you will desert me. The scriptures say God will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I'm raised from the dead, I will go ahead to you in Galilee and meet you there. Peter said to him, even if everyone deserts you, I will never do it. Jesus replied, I tell you the truth, Peter, that very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times that you even know me. No, Peter declared emphatically. Even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. And all the others vowed the same. Probably rather quieter. Jesus says something which one would have thought would be an utterly devastating comment. And he says it in such a matter-of-fact way. On the way, Jesus told them all of you will desert me. Imagine that. You've got a group of Jesus' close friends who've just celebrated the Last Supper with him. And he suddenly says, you're all going to desert me. But Peter, it appears, hardly notices what Jesus has said. Certainly doesn't feel its weight. Because he simply says, I'm never going to do that. And then when Jesus makes an even more piercing statement, Peter, you will deny me 3 times. Again, Peter seems to continue unabashed. No, said Peter, declared emphatically. Now, the Greek construction of these words here, which, by the way, I'm not trying to impress you with my Greek. I do look these things up. The Greek here has the sense that Peter repeatedly insisted. He went on and on and on about, no, I won't, you know this is never going to happen to me. I don't care what anybody else does. I'm not going to do this. Declared emphatically. Now, I can think of dozens of ways Jesus could have responded to this. But he says nothing. Jesus says nothing. And they simply leave for the Mount of Olives. They simply leave for the Mount of Olives, and Jesus says, now, do you think it could possibly be Jesus was demonstrating the discipline of not having the last word? There were so many things he could have said to me. He said, Peter, look, did you hear what I just said to you? Peter, do you remember the number of times in the past 3 years that you guys I've said something, you guys thought there was no way it was ever going to happen, And it did. Can you remember those things, Peter? But he says none of those things. Why? Well, what I see in there is Jesus had the compassion not to rub Peter's face in something when he knew that it was not very long before Peter's heart would be broken. Peter was going to feel the pain in ways that we can almost not imagine. And so he showed Peter the compassion of not having the last word. And by doing that, he gave Dallas Willard a pattern to follow in that class. He did not have the last word. We're going to turn now to one of the earliest books in the Bible. The book of Job, which is reputed to be the first book, the earliest book written. And if you know the story of Job, you'll know that Job chapter 1 and verse 1 tells us that there was once a man called Job who lived in the land of Uz, and he was blameless, a man of complete integrity. He feared God. He stayed away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters and endless livestock. And he was by far the richest person in that area. He was a godly man who was deeply blessed. And then we have this strange conversation between God and Satan, where God seems to say, "Hey, Satan, did you see that my man Job? He's pretty good, huh?" And we have this conversation between Satan and God, and Satan says, "Yeah, he's okay, but you blessed him so much. You take away his blessing and see what happens then." And then Job loses everything. All his sons and daughters, his livestock, everything is gone. And yet, the scripture tells us that in all this, Job did not sin by blaming God. So God goes back to Satan and says, "Hey, you told me he was bound. If I took all the blessings I've given him away from him, he would blame me and deny me. But he didn't." And Satan says, yeah, okay. But you take his health away, then he'll be done. He will not be able to survive. And so God says, okay, but you can't kill him. You have to keep him alive. And so Satan proceeds to do that. And he is reduced to scraping the skin off the dead skin off him. He's in a terrible state. Satan replies, "Skin for skin." So Satan left the Lord's presence, and he struck Job with terrible boils from head to foot. Job scraped his skin from a piece of broken pottery as he sat among the ashes. And, even his wife says, "Okay, Job, time to pack it in." His wife said to him, "Are you still trying to maintain your integrity? Curse God and die." But Job doesn't do that. About that time, 3 of his friends heard that, Job was in a bad way. And so they packed up their belongings and they came to spend some time with Job. I'm going to read for you chapter 2 and verse 11 to 13. When Job's 3 friends heard the tragedy he had suffered, they got together and traveled from their homes to comfort and console him. Their names were Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. When they saw Job from a distance, they scarcely recognized him. Wailing loudly, they tore their robes and threw dust in the air over their heads to show their grief. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and nights. No one said a word to Job, for they saw that his suffering was too great for words. Our three friends, I believe, give us a powerful picture of community support and care. They came, they saw Job sitting in ashes. They realized and they felt they had no words to describe, no words to comfort him, no words that felt like they would make a difference. And so they simply wept with him and sat in silence because his suffering was too great for words. Having been through personal experiences with sickness, especially with my first wife, Sarah, and to a certain extent myself, I can tell you there are times when, however much you love the people who come to visit you, you wish they would be quiet. You wish they wouldn't feel, and I completely understand why, but you completely understand why they really want to say something that'll make a difference. But really there isn't anything. I can't tell you how often during my cancer treatment I was extraordinarily grateful when Maggie just sat there beside my bed. Didn't require me to speak to her. Didn't require me to do anything other than she just was there. And that's what these three friends of Job do. And wouldn't it have been amazing if they'd stuck with that tactic? If they had stuck with that particular way of caring for him? But they get to that moment when they can't hold themselves back any longer. Chapter 4 and verse 2. Eliphaz the Temanite replied, it said to Job, will you be patient and let me speak a word? For who could keep from speaking out? And then from that moment on, judgmentalism, legalism, and self-righteousness pour forth from these three friends, and then another one who joins them a little bit later. They all know exactly why Job is in the mess that he's in. They all know exactly what he's supposed to do. What he must repent of, how he must change. And all of the wondrous ministry of love and compassion that they had poured out on Job in those first 7 days was, I suggest, was destroyed by the lack of silence that they experienced, that was experienced over the. And in fact, when you come to the end of the book of Job, you'll discover that God admonishes them royally for their behavior and for the things that they didn't, the way in which they spoke to Job. Compassion would have kept quiet. Compassion would have been silent. And they would have continued what they learned before. Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 7 tells us that Jesus would experience, he was oppressed and treated harshly, yet he never said a word. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep is silent before his shearers, he did not open his mouth. Jesus' silence would become a definitive sign of the greatest act of love and compassion history has ever seen. As he approaches the ultimate moment of shutting up when he was nailed to a cross, he was before Pilate. And Pilate can't understand him. Pilate's just like, I'm sure that we would have, certainly I would have been. He can't understand why on earth Jesus doesn't defend himself. And he says this, John chapter 19. When Pilate heard this, he was more frightened than ever. He took Jesus back into the headquarters again and asked him, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. "Why don't you talk to me?" Pilate demanded. "Don't you realize that I have the power to release you or crucify you?" Then Jesus does respond. He says, "You would have no power over me at all if it wasn't given to you from above. So the one who handed me over to you has the greatest sin." Pilate goes on and says, and exchanges with the Jewish authorities, but then Jesus says no more, and he allows Pilate to have the last word. Pilate sends him off and turns Jesus over to be crucified. But the result of that exchange is the greatest act of compassion ever. The experience of silence goes on into the garden. When we left off with in Mark chapter 14, we left off when Jesus went into Garden of Gethsemane, having not had the last word with Peter. They go into the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus is deeply troubled, and he prays to his Father in heaven. In fact, he prays 3 times. And each of those times, he experiences his Father's absolute silence. It's almost as if he doesn't answer him. His Father doesn't answer him, and I've wrestled with this, and I've asked myself, why is God so silent? And I think at this point, God knows that his Son is absolutely aware of what is about to happen and how it will happen. And yet Jesus demonstrates to us that we are always welcome to ask if things could change, to ask if things could be different, to ask if there could be another way. But like Jesus, we have to be willing to accept 2 things. That we won't get an answer, but we can absolutely trust, as Jesus did, that what God would do and the way God would do it would be the absolute best, as we see in our definition of agape that we've been using. That what God was about to do was the absolute best. And Jesus trusted that, because he said, "Nevertheless, your will be done. Because I know that your will is the best." Your will is the best. And so, even though he asks 3 times, which to me such an encouragement, because there are so many times when I want to say to God, oh, could you do something different? How much longer do I have to wait? How much longer do I have to do this or that or the other? But I'm learning that what God will do will be the absolute best, because that's the way he loves me, and that's the way he loves you. That uncomfortable or difficult as it may seem at the time, the depth of his love will not change, because, and so he is sometimes silent, because he knows that we know, and he wants us, and in a sense he stands with us in the pain of knowing. He stands with us in the pain of knowing what we know and knowing what we'd rather not know. The power of silence in those circumstances is the power of deep love and compassion. So we can see that Jesus exercises the ability not to have the last word. He experiences God not having the last word with him, but remaining in silence. And we see in the book of Job how powerful it is to be silent, but how desperately destructive it is to say what we shouldn't say. Which I think is the reason why James in his epistle tells us, understand this, my dear brothers and sisters, you must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. If you claim to be religious, but you don't control your tongue, you're fooling yourself, and your religion is worthless. You see, we saw that Job's three friends destroyed their compassion when they couldn't contain themselves any longer. If we're to love like Jesus, we must know the moment not to say any more. When I read these things, and as I've studied and learned for this particular message, I just painfully have remembered the number of times as my boys were growing up when I didn't practice the discipline of not having the last word, probably about 6 or 7 times in the same conversation. I had so many last words. I could not believe that if they didn't respond in the right way to what I said, it must be that they didn't understand it, so I should say it again. Another way. And I did, over and over again. And I am so ashamed. Because I also probably said it louder each time. And you know, the truth is that you and I have an entirely new context for shutting up. It's called social media. You know, I'm sure most of you have experienced the fact that if you look at any of whatever, unless you've abandoned social media entirely, and I couldn't blame you if you have, if you look at social media, then somebody says something, and you just, a bit like Job's friends, you cannot keep inside the fact that they must be corrected. You must respond. I can tell you that some of my biggest mistakes, other than the ones I made with my children, some of my biggest mistakes have been the times when I did not control myself And I responded. Rather than simply recognizing that maybe a response was necessary, maybe a response was justified, all of those things may be true. But for me to deliver it at that time in that way was hopeless. For me, I needed to exercise the discipline of shutting up and recognize that it would be God who would correct those things in his own good time. And that maybe I make a greater contribution to the kingdom by preserving the relationship that I have rather than having the last word. So I don't know about you, but I think that this is just another piece of my developing understanding of what it's like to love like Jesus. To see people the way he sees them. To listen and understand and hear their stories the way that Jesus does. To recognize the things that can get in my way. When I feel justified in my legalism, self-righteousness, or judgmentalism. How that can get in the way of my compassion and how I see Jesus loving. And how, more often than I probably dare suggest, the discipline of compassion will involve the discipline of shutting up. May the Lord help me to learn this more and more.